The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace training grounds as Marcus Chen adjusted his black belt for the last time. 20 years of martial arts training had brought him to this moment. His knuckles bore the scars of countless sparring sessions. And his body moved with the fluid grace of someone who had transformed fighting into an art form. At 32 years old, Marcus had competed in 17 international tournaments, won 12 of them, and earned respect in dojos across 3 continents. But today felt different. Today, he stood in a place where ancient tradition met modern ceremony, and one wrong move could cost him everything. The invitation had arrived 3 months earlier, delivered by a courier in formal attire. The Royal Guard of Aldermore, a small European principality nestled between Switzerland and Austria, was hosting an international martial arts exhibition. 20 fighters from around the world would demonstrate their skills before the royal family and distinguished guests. Marcus had initially dismissed it as just another exhibition match, the kind where fighters pulled their punches and performed choreographed sequences for applause. His instructor, Master Liu, convinced him otherwise. Master Liu was a 70-year-old man whose weathered face told stories of a lifetime spent perfecting the ancient arts. He had trained in the mountains of China, fought in underground tournaments in Hong Kong, and eventually opened a modest dojo in San Francisco, where Marcus had found him 15 years ago. That evening, Master Liu sat across from Marcus in the small tea room adjacent to the training floor. Pouring green tea with hands that never trembled despite their age, the old master explained that Aldermore's royal guard wasn't just ceremonial. Unlike the changing of guards that tourists photographed in London or Stockholm, these men trained daily in combat techniques passed down through generations. They were soldiers first, ceremonial figures second. The exhibition wasn't about performance. It was about honor, discipline, and the meeting of different martial traditions. Master Liu's eyes grew distant as he spoke of his own youth. When he had visited similar gatherings and learned that true martial arts wasn't about defeating opponents, but understanding them, Marcus listened. But part of him remained skeptical. He had faced opponents from every fighting style imaginable. He had traded blows with kickboxers in Thailand, grappled with Brazilian jiu-jitsu champions, and sparred with karate masters in Japan. What could palace guards possibly show him that he hadn't already seen? Still, he respected Master Liu too much to voice these doubts. He accepted the invitation, booked his flight, and began preparing for what he assumed would be an interesting cultural experience rather than a real challenge. The flight to Aldermore took 14 hours with a connection in Frankfurt. Marcus used the time to review footage of previous exhibitions held at the palace. Most showed impressive displays of discipline and coordination. Guards moved in perfect synchronization, their movements sharp and precise. But something about the videos bothered him. The guards never seemed to extend themselves fully. Their strikes stopped short, their blocks appeared measured, and their footwork, while technically perfect, lacked the aggressive intent he associated with real combat. It confirmed his suspicion that this would be more theater than true martial arts. Aldermore itself surprised him. The principality covered less than 100 square miles. Its landscape dominated by steep mountains and valleys dotted with villages that looked like they belonged in fairy tales. The capital city, where the palace stood, combined medieval architecture with modern amenities. Cobblestone streets wound between buildings that dated back centuries, yet cafes served espresso and offered free Wi-Fi. The palace occupied the highest point in the city. It had stone walls and towers visible from everywhere. Marcus checked into a hotel near the palace 2 days before the exhibition. The organizing committee had arranged accommodations for all participants, giving them time to adjust and tour the facilities. That first evening, Marcus met some of the other fighters. There was Yuki from Japan, a woman in her late 20s who specialized in Aikido and moved like water finding its path. Dmitri from Russia practiced Sistema, the mysterious martial art developed for special forces. Carlos from Brazil brought capoeira's acrobatic energy, while Amira from Egypt demonstrated techniques from Tatsib, the ancient Egyptian stick-fighting art. They gathered in the hotel's restaurant, sharing stories and comparing training philosophies. Marcus found himself enjoying their company more than he expected. These weren't just athletes seeking glory. Each carried their martial tradition with genuine reverence, treating it as both a physical discipline and a spiritual path. Yuki spoke about finding balance rather than dominance. Dmitri explained how Sistema taught practitioners to remain calm under pressure, using an attacker's force against them. Carlos described capoeira as a conversation between fighters, each movement both question and answer. The conversation eventually turned to the Royal Guard. Carlos had researched their history extensively. The Guard traced its roots back to the 13th century when Aldermore first established independence from larger neighboring kingdoms. Over centuries, they had evolved from simple soldiers into an elite unit, protected the royal family, and symbolized the principality's sovereignty. Their training combined European fencing traditions, wrestling techniques from various regions, and what some texts described as their own unique striking system. Developed in isolation over generations. Amira had actually spoken with one of the guards earlier that day. She described him as courteous but reserved, answering questions about ceremonial duties but deflecting anything about their actual training. When she asked about their combat effectiveness, he had smiled politely and said only that the guard took its responsibilities seriously. The evasiveness intrigued Marcus. Either they were hiding limited skills behind mystique, or they possessed capabilities they preferred to keep private. He suspected the former. The next morning, participants received a tour of the palace training grounds. The facility occupied a courtyard surrounded by high stone walls, creating an enclosed space about the size of a basketball court. The ground itself was covered with packed dirt that looked ancient, worn smooth by countless feet over hundreds of years. Weapons racks lined one wall, holding swords, staffs, and other traditional implements. A small raised platform at one end provided seating for observers. Their guide was Captain Eric Volker, commander of the Royal Guard's training division. He was perhaps 40 years old, tall and lean, with close-cropped blonde hair going gray at the temples. His dress uniform was immaculate, but Marcus noticed the way he moved. There was an economy to his gestures, no wasted motion, suggesting someone completely comfortable in his body. When he demonstrated the exhibition space, pointing out where each participant would perform, his footwork displayed perfect balance. Captain Volker explained the exhibition format. Each martial artist would have 15 minutes to demonstrate their art's core principles and techniques. The Royal Guard would then perform their own demonstration, showing techniques passed down through their tradition. Finally, there would be an optional sparring session, where willing participants could engage in controlled matches with Guard members. Everything would be supervised to ensure safety and respect for all involved. Marcus raised his hand and asked about the sparring rules. Captain Volker's expression remained neutral as he explained that matches would be light contact to the body, no contact to the face, and would stop immediately if any participant felt uncomfortable or at risk. Matches would last 3 minutes unless ended earlier. The goal wasn't to determine winners, but to facilitate exchange between different martial traditions. Marcus nodded, filing away the information while mentally noting that these restrictions would severely limit what anyone could demonstrate. That afternoon, Marcus trained alone in the hotel's small fitness center. He ran through his forms, the patterns of movement drilled into muscle memory over thousands of hours. His style blended traditional kung fu with practical fighting applications he had developed through competition. Master Liu had taught him that forms were alphabets, individual letters that students combined into words and sentences that expressed their personal understanding of combat. Marcus knew his alphabet perfectly. His words and sentences had defeated opponents across the world. He felt confident, perhaps too confident, about the coming exhibition. The evening before the exhibition, organizers hosted a formal dinner at the palace. Participants dressed in their finest clothes and gathered in a dining hall that showcased Aldermore's history. Portraits of rulers going back centuries lined the walls. Armor and weapons from different eras filled display cases. The current Prince of Aldermore, a man in his 60s named Heinrich, greeted each participant personally, speaking multiple languages fluently and demonstrating genuine knowledge of different martial arts traditions. Marcus found himself seated near several Guard members who attended the dinner out of uniform. They were surprisingly easy to talk with, sharing stories about training mishaps and injuries that any martial artist could relate to. One of them, a man named Stefan, had actually trained briefly in Kung Fu during a cultural exchange program years earlier. He asked Marcus about Master Lu, wondering if the teacher had ever competed in the underground tournaments that had been popular in Hong. During the 70s and 80s, the question caught Marcus off guard. He had never asked Master Lu about his competitive history, assuming his teacher had always been primarily an instructor. Stefan saw his confusion and smiled, explaining that old tournament records sometimes circulated among martial arts communities. Master Lu's name appeared in several, always associated with exceptional skill, but also with a reputation for restraint. Apparently, Liu had been known for winning matches by neutralizing opponents rather than overwhelming them. Approach that had earned both respect and criticism in circles that valued aggression. Marcus made a mental note to ask his teacher about this when he returned home. But more immediately, Stefan's casual knowledge of obscure tournament history suggested that the Guards members were more deeply connected to the broader martial arts world than he had assumed. They weren't isolated soldiers playing at fighting arts. They were genuine practitioners who had studied and respected the global martial community. It forced Marcus to reconsider his assumptions about what the next day might reveal. After dinner, he stood on a palace balcony looking out over the city lights. The mountains rose dark against the starlit sky, and the air carried the chill of alpine elevation. Tomorrow he would demonstrate everything he had worked for, everything Master Lu had taught him, before an audience that included both his fellow martial artists and members of a guard whose capabilities remained mysterious. For the first time since receiving the invitation, Marcus felt something more than confidence. He felt anticipation mixed with a thread of uncertainty that made his pulse quicken. He thought about Master Lu's words from months ago, about martial arts being ultimately about understanding rather than defeating. At the time, Marcus had nodded and smiled, giving the response, a student offers a beloved teacher even when he doesn't fully agree. Now, standing in this ancient place where tradition ran centuries deep, those words resonated differently. Perhaps tomorrow wouldn't be about proving his superiority. Perhaps it would be about discovering something he hadn't known he needed to learn. The exhibition began at 10 in the morning with ceremony and tradition. Palace staff arranged seating around the training courtyard, creating an intimate theater where perhaps 200 guests would watch the demonstrations. The royal family occupied an elevated platform decorated with Aldermore's traditional colors of deep blue and silver. Prince Heinrich sat at the center, flanked by his wife and 2 adult children. Around them sat military officials, diplomats, and local dignitaries who had traveled to witness this rare event. Marcus arrived early, wearing the traditional black uniform that signified his rank and achievement. His belt was tied perfectly, its ends hanging at precisely the right length, a detail that might seem trivial to outsiders, but meant everything in martial arts circles. Other participants filtered in, each wearing the distinctive attire of their discipline. Yuki wore a crisp white GI with her Aikido school's emblem embroidered on the chest. Carlos wore the white pants and yellow cord of his Capoeira Academy. Together, they created a rainbow of martial traditions, each color and style representing years of dedication. The Royal Guard entered last, moving in formation with the precision of a military unit. They wore ceremonial uniforms that combined historical elements with practical functionality. High-collared jackets in deep blue featured silver braiding across the chest and shoulders. Polished black boots struck the ground in unison as they marched to their position along one wall of the courtyard. Captain Volker stood at their front, and for the first time, Marcus noticed something he had missed during the tour. These men weren't just soldiers trained to fight. They carried themselves with a particular confidence that came from truly dangerous capability kept carefully controlled. Prince Heinrich opened the exhibition with a short speech delivered in English, acknowledging that it served as the common language among participants. He spoke about martial arts as bridges between cultures, physical expressions of philosophies that transcended borders. He mentioned that Aldermore, despite its small size, had always valued the warrior traditions that help small nations maintain their independence and dignity. His words were gracious and thoughtful, setting a tone of mutual respect rather than competition. Yuki performed first, her Aikido demonstration showing how a smaller person could redirect an attacker's force using circular movements and joint locks. She moved with such fluidity that it barely looked like fighting at all. It's more like a dance where one partner led and the other had no choice but to follow. 2 of her students from Japan assisted, attacking her with various grabs and strikes that she effortlessly neutralized. The audience applauded appreciatively. Marcus found himself genuinely impressed by the efficiency of her technique. Dmitri followed with Sistema, his demonstration emphasizing relaxation and natural movement. He explained that tension was the enemy of effective response, that the body possessed instinctive wisdom if the mind could stop interfering. His movements seemed almost lazy until the moment of contact, when explosive power appeared from nowhere. He had 3 training partners simultaneously attack him, and he navigated through them like smoke, always just beyond their reach, while landing controlled strikes that clearly could have been devastating if delivered with full force. Carlos brought energy that contrasted sharply with the previous demonstrations. Capoeira filled the courtyard with music from a berimbau, the single-string instrument that provided rhythm for the fight dance. He cartwheeled, spun, and kicked in sequences that seemed impossible, his body defying gravity while maintaining constant awareness of his opponent. The martial application was clear despite the acrobatic display. Any of those spinning kicks could crack ribs or break bones. The audience broke into spontaneous applause several times during his 15 minutes. Amira demonstrated Tadib, the Egyptian stick-fighting art that traced back thousands of years to pharaonic times. She explained that peasant farmers had practiced it for both self-defense and as a cultural tradition kept alive through generations. Her movements with the long stick were mesmerizing, flowing from defensive parries to strikes that whistled through the air. She emphasized that Tatib taught distance management and timing, skills fundamental to all martial arts. Her demonstration partner, a fellow Egyptian martial artist, matched her skill level, and their exchange had the quality of a conversation conducted in movements rather than words. Marcus performed 5th, stepping into the center of the courtyard with a bow to the royal family and then to his fellow martial artists. He had planned his demonstration carefully, showing both the traditional forms that honored Kung Fu's roots and the practical applications he had developed through competition. He began with a form called Tiger and Crane, its movements alternating between powerful, grounded strikes and light, flowing deflections. The contrast illustrated Kung Fu's core philosophy, containing both hard and soft, both aggressive and yielding. For the application portion, he asked Dmitri to assist him, figuring the Russian's Sistema background would make him an unpredictable partner. They moved through several scenarios, Marcus demonstrating how Kung Fu principles handled different types of attacks. A straight punch was redirected and countered with a palm strike. A grab was broken with a joint lock. A kick was checked and followed by a sweep. Everything flowed naturally, and Marcus felt completely in his element. The audience's attention remained focused, heads nodding at particularly effective techniques. As his 15 minutes concluded, Marcus felt satisfied with his performance. He had represented his art well, honored Master Lu's teaching, and demonstrated real skill without showboating. He bowed again and returned to his position among the other participants. Captain Volker approached the center of the courtyard, and suddenly the atmosphere changed. The guard members who had been standing relaxed along the wall straightened subtly. It wasn't a dramatic shift, just a tightening of attention that Marcus recognized from his own dojo. When Master Lu prepared to demonstrate something important, Captain Volker spoke briefly about the guard's martial tradition. He explained that it had developed in relative isolation, influenced by various European fighting systems, but shaped primarily by the specific needs of protecting the royal family in a small principality surrounded by larger, potentially hostile nations. Guard members trained daily, passed down techniques through direct transmission from senior to junior, and maintained standards that emphasized effectiveness over aesthetics. Unlike sport martial arts, they never trained for points or judges' scores. They trained for outcomes where mistakes meant failure in their protective duties. 8. Guard members joined Volker in the center. They moved through a series of coordinated drills that showcased their system's core elements. The footwork resembled fencing, quick and precise, maintaining optimal distance. The hand techniques looked simple, but devastating. Direct strikes aimed at vulnerable targets without any wasted motion. The grappling incorporated throws and controls that could quickly neutralize an attacker. Everything linked together seamlessly, suggesting a system that had been refined over centuries to eliminate anything unnecessary. What struck Marcus most was the intensity beneath their control. When they demonstrated strikes, pulling them just short of contact, the air itself seemed to compress. When they showed throws, their partners fell with authority that indicated real force despite the cooperative nature of the demonstration. These weren't martial artists playing at combat effectiveness. These were combat-effective practitioners playing at demonstration. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone with real fighting experience. Captain Volker then called for the optional sparring portion of the exhibition. He reiterated the rules: light contact to the body, no face contact, 3-minute rounds, immediate stop if anyone felt at risk. Several participants volunteered immediately. Yuki paired with a guard member named Lars, their match showcasing Aikido's circular movements against the guard's linear efficiency. Neither fighter established clear dominance, instead creating an interesting dialogue between different approaches. The 3 minutes ended with both fighters bowing and smiling, clearly having enjoyed the exchange. Dmitri sparred next with a guard member named Klaus. Their match had a different quality, both fighters using relaxed, almost casual movements that occasionally exploded into brief exchanges of strikes and counters. Klaus demonstrated excellent adaptation, adjusting his strategy as he figured out Dmitri's system of principles. The round ended with mutual respect and what looked like both fighters wishing they had more time to explore their interaction. Marcus felt the familiar pre-fight sensation building in his chest. Part of him wanted to volunteer, to test himself against these guard members and their mysterious system. Another part urged caution, sensing that this situation contained elements he didn't fully understand. Before he could decide, Captain Volker looked directly at him and asked if he would like to participate. The question was polite, even deferential, but something in Volker's eyes suggested this wasn't a random selection. The captain had been watching Marcus's demonstration carefully and had chosen him specifically. Marcus stood and bowed, accepting the invitation. Volker gestured to a guard member who stepped forward from the line. His name tag read Kristoff Anderson. He was perhaps 30 years old, average height, with an athletic build that suggested strength without bulk. His face remained expressionless as he bowed to Marcus, but his eyes were alert and calculating. They moved to the center of the courtyard while the crowd settled into attentive silence. Captain Volker reviewed the rules one final time, emphasizing control and respect. Marcus and Kristoff touched gloves, a modern gesture that seemed slightly out of place in this traditional setting, but served to acknowledge the mutual agreement to engage. They separated to opposite sides of the sparring area, taking fighting stances that revealed their different approaches. Marcus dropped into a kung fu stance, weight distributed 60-40 between his legs, hands positioned to both defend and strike. Kristoff stood more upright, almost casual, his hands lower than Marcus expected, his feet positioned for quick movement in any direction. A whistle blew to begin the round. For the first 20 seconds, neither fighter committed. They circled, testing distance, making small feints to observe reactions. Marcus threw a quick jab to gauge Kristoff's defense. The guard member slipped it with minimal movement, not blocking or parrying but simply ensuring his head wasn't where the punch arrived. Marcus noted the efficiency. He tried a low kick next, targeting Kristoff's lead leg. Again, minimal movement, Kristoff lifting his foot just enough to avoid contact, then resetting instantly. Marcus increased his aggression slightly, still respecting the rules, but trying to establish some kind of offense. He threw a combination, jab, cross, hook to the body. Kristoff evaded the first two and absorbed the third on his forearm, the light contact barely moving him. Then, faster than Marcus expected, Kristoff countered with a straight punch toward Marcus's solar plexus. Marcus blocked it, but the speed and directness surprised him. This wasn't a trained athlete throwing a punch. This was a trained fighter. They reset and continued. Marcus tried various approaches, mixing up his angles and rhythms. Everything felt slightly off. Kristoff moved in ways that didn't match standard martial arts responses. There was no telegraphing, no preparation before strikes. He seemed to operate from a state of constant readiness, able to attack or defend from any position without setup. Marcus found himself working harder than expected, and they were barely a minute into the round. A thought occurred to Marcus, one he immediately dismissed as arrogant. He wondered if the light contact rules were protecting Kristoff rather than protecting participants from the guard, perhaps with real intensity. Marcus's superior competition experience would create a significant gap in their skill levels. The thought made him smile slightly, which Kristoff apparently noticed because the guard member's expression shifted to something that might have been amusement. Marcus decided to test his theory about the rules protecting Kristoff. He increased his speed and power while staying within the light contact parameters, throwing combinations that forced most opponents into defensive shells. Kristoff responded by moving less, not more. Instead of backing up or circling away, he moved forward into Marcus's offense, closing the distance to where kicks became ineffective and punches had to be shortened. It was counterintuitive and deeply uncomfortable for Marcus, who suddenly found himself managing distance backward when he had intended to press his attack. Kristoff landed several light body shots during this exchange, each one technically legal but carrying more authority than Marcus had delivered. They weren't hard enough to hurt or violate the rules, but they communicated capability. The message was clear. The guard member was choosing to strike lightly, not being forced to. Marcus felt his confidence waver. This was supposed to be a friendly exchange, a cultural dialogue between martial traditions. Why did it suddenly feel like he was being tested in a way he didn't fully understand? They broke apart and reset with about 90 seconds remaining in the round. Marcus adjusted his strategy, going back to more traditional kung fu approaches that emphasized deflection and control rather than aggressive combinations. He threw a straight punch that Kristoff started to slip, but Marcus anticipated the slip and changed the punch's trajectory mid-flight, following Kristoff's head movement. It was an advanced technique that required excellent control and practice against skilled opponents. The modified punch should have touched Kristoff's temple, scoring a clean point in any competition setting, except Kristoff wasn't there. Somehow the guard member had recognized the adjustment and altered his slip, moving just far enough to stay out of range while simultaneously throwing his own counter. His hand came up in what Marcus initially thought was a back fist, but the angle was wrong. It wasn't aimed at his face or head. It was rising toward his throat in a movement that, if delivered with full power, would have been a potentially lethal strike. Kristoff stopped at a full 6 inches short, holding it there for a half-second to ensure Marcus understood what had almost happened, then withdrew and reset to his stance. The courtyard went completely silent. Marcus felt his heart hammering. That hadn't been a sparring technique. That had been combat application, a strike designed to crush a windpipe or break vertebrae. Kristoff had demonstrated it under perfect control, but the message was unmistakable. In a real fight, Marcus would have just died. The realization struck him with physical force. All his tournament victories, all his competition experience, all his black belt expertise suddenly felt like achievements in a game, whose rules didn't apply to what the guard trained for. Captain Volker called time, ending the round early. Marcus and Kristoff bowed to each other, but Marcus's bow felt mechanical, his mind still processing what had just occurred. The audience applauded politely, apparently unaware of how significant that near-throat strike had been. Only the other martial artists understood. Marcus could see it in Yuki's expression, in the way Dimitri nodded slowly and Carlos's suddenly serious face. They recognized that they had just witnessed something beyond the usual exhibition sparring. Marcus returned to his position among the participants, his legs feeling less steady than they should. Kristoff rejoined the guard line, his expression never changing. Captain Volker continued facilitating other matches, but Marcus barely registered them. His mind kept replaying those 3 minutes, analyzing where he had misjudged the situation. He had assumed the guard's martial system would be limited by its isolation. The competition experience would give him an advantage. He had been completely wrong. The exhibition concluded with closing remarks from Prince Heinrich, praising all participants for their skill and the spirit of mutual respect they had demonstrated. There was a reception scheduled in an adjacent hall where participants could mingle with guests and each other. Marcus went through the motions, accepting congratulations from spectators who had enjoyed his earlier demonstration. But his thoughts remained on the sparring match and the uncomfortable truths it had revealed. Yuki found him standing alone near a window overlooking the city. She held 2 glasses of wine and offered him one. For a moment, they stood in silence, and then she spoke quietly, acknowledging what they had both recognized during his match with Kristoff. The guard system wasn't theatrical or ceremonial. It was real in a way that sport martial arts, however technically excellent, could never quite replicate. She mentioned that her Aikido master had once trained with soldiers, and he had returned from that experience humbled, realizing that martial arts designed for actual life-and-death situations carried a weight that dojo training couldn't fully capture. Marcus appreciated her words, but found little comfort in them. He had spent 20 years building his skills, earning his rank, proving himself against top competitors. One 3-minute match shouldn't undermine all of that. Yet it had. Not because Kristoff had beaten him in any official sense, but because the guard member had demonstrated a depth of capability that Marcus hadn't even known existed. It was like discovering that the mountain he had spent years climbing was actually just a foothill, and real peaks existed far beyond where he had thought the world ended. That evening, Marcus walked alone through the city's streets. The tournament victories that had once filled him with pride now seemed hollow. What did it matter that he could score points under referee supervision when someone like Kristoff could end a real fight in seconds? He found himself questioning everything: his training, his understanding of martial arts, even his decision to become a fighter. Master Lu's words about understanding rather than defeating kept echoing in his mind, taking on new significance. He eventually found himself at a small cafe near his hotel. The owner, an elderly woman who spoke limited English, served him coffee and a pastry. As he sat there, a voice asked if the seat across from him was taken. Marcus looked up to see Captain Volker, now out of uniform and wearing casual clothes. The captain asked if they could talk. Marcus gestured to the empty chair, curious about what the guard's training commander wanted to discuss. Volker ordered coffee and spent a moment arranging his thoughts. Then he began to speak, and what he said surprised Marcus. The captain apologized. Not for Kristoff's actions during the sparring match, but for putting Marcus in a situation where the differences between sport, fighting, and protection work would become so apparent. Volker explained that he had specifically chosen Marcus to spar with Kristoff because he could see that.
Nice.
Marcus was exceptionally skilled and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning. The captain had wanted to show Marcus something important, but he realized in hindsight that doing so publicly might have been unnecessarily harsh. Marcus sat silently, processing this information. Volker continued, explaining that the guard's training philosophy differed fundamentally from sport martial arts, because their mission differed fundamentally. Sport fighters trained to defeat opponents within rules. Guard members trained to protect people against threats that followed no rules. The techniques might look similar superficially, but the underlying intention, the weight behind every movement, came from completely different sources. A competition fighter asked how to win. A protection fighter asked what outcomes were acceptable and trained to ensure those outcomes occurred. The captain then said something that struck deep. He mentioned that he had watched Marcus's earlier demonstration closely and recognized genuine skill, real dedication, authentic martial arts. But he had also seen something troubling. Marcus fought with what Volker called a competitor's mindset. Every technique was about imposing his will, proving his superiority, defeating his opponent. There was nothing wrong with that mindset in competition, but it created blind spots. It made fighters focus on winning exchanges rather than surviving situations. It encouraged taking risks for glory rather than eliminating risks entirely. Marcus wanted to argue to defend his approach, but he couldn't. Volker's words resonated with something Marcus had felt during the match with Kristoff, but couldn't articulate. He had been fighting to demonstrate his skill, to look good, maybe even to impress the audience. Kristoff had been doing something else entirely. The guard member hadn't cared about looking good or scoring points. He had been managing a tactical problem with the minimum necessary effort, staying safe while ensuring he could end the situation instantly if needed. Volker asked if Marcus wanted to understand the difference more deeply. The guard occasionally accepted visiting martial artists for short training exchanges, usually a week or two, where outsiders could learn their system's principles while sharing their own knowledge. It wasn't common, and normally required recommendations from people the guard trusted. But Volker had been impressed by Marcus's demonstration and thought that Marcus might benefit from seeing what the guard actually trained for, not just the exhibition version they showed the public. The invitation caught Marcus completely off guard. Part of him wanted to refuse to return home and process everything that had happened. Another part recognized this as an extraordinary opportunity that might never come again. He asked what the training would involve. Volker explained it would be intensive, physically demanding, and at times uncomfortable. The guard didn't coddle visitors. If Marcus accepted, he would train alongside guard members in their regular sessions, learning their system from the ground up as if he were a recruit. His black belt, his tournament victories, his 20 years of experience would mean nothing. He would start as a beginner. Marcus felt his pride bristle at this. Start as a beginner, after everything he had achieved? But then he thought about that throat strike, about Kristoff's effortless control, about his own assumptions being shattered in 3 minutes. Maybe beginning again was exactly what he needed. He asked when the training could start. Volker smiled slightly and said that if Marcus was serious, he could join the morning session tomorrow. The guard trained at 6 in the morning, every morning, in a different facility than the exhibition courtyard. He provided an address and told Marcus to wear comfortable training clothes. Nothing with rank insignia or school patches, just plain clothes. Marcus walked back to his hotel with his mind spinning. He should have felt humiliated by Volker's assessment, angry at being told his life's work had fundamental flaws. Instead, he felt something unexpected, excitement. For the first time in years, he would step into a training environment where he wasn't the expert, where his reputation meant nothing, where he would have to learn rather than perform. It was terrifying and thrilling simultaneously. That night, he called Master Liu despite the time difference. His teacher answered on the third ring, sounding alert despite it being 3 in the morning in San Francisco. Marcus explained everything that had happened. The exhibition, the sparring match, his conversation with Captain Volker, the invitation to train with the guard. He confessed his confusion about what to do and admitted that part of him felt like his years of training had been exposed as inadequate. Master Liu listened without interrupting, and then he laughed. It wasn't a mocking laugh, but one of recognition and perhaps relief. The old master explained that he had sent Marcus to this exhibition hoping something like this would happen. Liu had known about Aldermore's guard, had even met former members during his own travels decades earlier. He knew they possessed something rare, martial arts maintained and refined for actual protection, work rather than sport or demonstration. He had hoped that exposing Marcus to this would crack open his students' certainty, would create space for deeper understanding. The teacher told Marcus about his own similar experience in his 20s, when an old security specialist in Hong Kong had shown him that everything Liu thought he knew about fighting was incomplete. It had been devastating at the time, but it ultimately led him to a much deeper understanding of martial arts. The underground tournaments Liu had competed in afterward weren't about proving himself anymore. They were about testing and refining what he had learned, using competition as a laboratory rather than a validation of his worth. Master Liu strongly encouraged Marcus to accept Volker's invitation. He acknowledged it would be difficult, that Marcus would have to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and his training, but that discomfort was necessary for real growth. The old master said something Marcus would remember for years afterward. Pride was like a closed fist, holding tightly to what it already possessed. Humility was an open hand, ready to receive what it hadn't known existed. If Marcus wanted to continue growing as a martial artist, he needed to open his hand. Marcus arrived at the guards' training facility 15 minutes early the next morning. The building was unmarked, located in a quiet section of the capital, away from tourist areas. He wore plain black training pants and a gray shirt without any logos or emblems. The door was unlocked, opening into a corridor that led to a large training hall. Unlike the palace courtyard with its ancient atmosphere, this space was purely functional. Padded mats covered the floor. Heavy bags hung from ceiling chains. Training weapons lined the walls. Everything showed signs of hard, regular use. 8 guard members were already present, stretching and warming up. They greeted Marcus politely, but without fanfare, treating him simply as another person joining their session. Kristoff was among them, and he nodded to Marcus with no indication that their previous match meant anything special. Captain Volker entered precisely at 6, carrying a training pad and a stopwatch. He welcomed Marcus formally, explained that this would be a standard morning session, and asked if Marcus had any injuries or limitations to consider. Marcus said he was healthy and ready to train. The warm-up surprised Marcus with its intensity. They began with joint rotations and dynamic stretching, similar to what Marcus did in his own training. But then they moved into movement drills that demanded both cardiovascular endurance and coordination. They crawled, rolled, jumped, and moved in patterns that required constant attention to balance and positioning. After just 10 minutes, Marcus was breathing hard and sweating. The guard members looked barely affected. He realized they did this every single day, that their baseline conditioning existed at a level he had never maintained. Captain Volker called them to attention and explained the day's focus: fundamental striking principles. He asked Marcus to demonstrate a basic punch from his kung fu system. Marcus stepped forward and showed a traditional straight punch, explaining the body mechanics and power generation as Master Leo had taught him. Volker thanked him and then asked Kristoff to demonstrate a basic punch from the guard system. The differences were subtle but significant. Kristoff's punch originated from a slightly different stance, weight distributed more evenly between his feet. The strike itself followed a more direct line with less rotation in chamber than Kung Fu's traditional punch. But what struck Marcus most was the speed. Kristoff's punch traveled from ready position to full extension in what felt like a single instant, with no preliminary movement to telegraph its coming. Volker explained that the guard striking system eliminated all preparation, all setup. Threats could appear instantly, and responses needed to match that speed. They spent the next hour drilling just that one punch. Marcus worked alongside guard members who were apparently junior in rank, all of them practicing the same basic movement hundreds of times. Volker walked among them, making minor corrections to positioning, angles, and timing. When he reached Marcus, he spent extra time adjusting things that felt fundamental to how Marcus had punched for 20 years. The captain moved Marcus's rear foot slightly forward, adjusted his hip angle, changed where his shoulders aligned over his hips. Each adjustment felt awkward and weak at first, but Volker patiently explained the tactical reasoning behind every detail. By the end of that hour, Marcus's arm ached from repetition, and he still felt like he barely grasped what they were teaching. The punch looked simple, performing it correctly while maintaining all the principles. Volker emphasized required attention to dozens of small details simultaneously. He watched the senior guard members moving through the drill and saw how effortlessly they maintained perfect form even at high speed and high repetition. That effortlessness came from having done this exact drill thousands of times until it became completely natural. The next section covered defensive principles. Volker explained that the guard system emphasized not being where strikes arrived, rather than blocking or parrying when possible. Every defensive movement positioned them simultaneously for immediate counterattack. They never wanted to waste movement purely on defense. If they moved to avoid a punch, that movement itself created the angle for their own strike. Marcus recognized this principle intellectually, but applying it proved far harder than understanding it. They practiced with partners, one person throwing controlled strikes while the other moved to evade and counter. Marcus paired with a guard member named Henrik, who threw punches with the same direct efficiency Kristoff had demonstrated. Marcus found himself constantly reacting too late, or moving too much. Henrik's strikes were so direct and sudden that Marcus's trained responses from years of sparring felt inadequate. He kept trying to block instead of evade, kept moving backward instead of two angles, kept separating defense from offense when the system demanded they be unified. Henrik was patient but honest in his feedback. He explained that Marcus was fighting like someone who had time, who operated in an environment with rounds and breaks and rules. The guard trained, assuming they never had time, that every moment might be the moment when real danger appeared, that wasting any motion or opportunity could mean failing to protect someone who depended on them. It wasn't about being faster or stronger. It was about eliminating everything unnecessary until only pure effectiveness remained. 2 hours into the session, they took a short break. Marcus sat against the wall, drinking water and watching the guard members joke with each other. They seemed relaxed despite the intensity of training, comfortable in their bodies and their environment. Stefan, the guard member, who had asked about Master Lu at the dinner, sat down next to Marcus and asked how he was finding the training. Marcus admitted it was humbling. The techniques he thought were simple were proving complex in ways he hadn't anticipated. Stefan smiled and shared his own experience when he first joined the guard. He had trained in kickboxing for years. Won regional tournaments, felt confident in his skills. His first month with the guard had destroyed that confidence. Everything he thought he knew had to be rebuilt from foundation up. The system wasn't better or worse than kickboxing, Stefan explained. It was simply designed for a different purpose. Sport fighting optimized for rules-based competition. The guard system optimized for protecting people in unpredictable situations where failure meant real consequences. The conversation reminded Marcus of what Master Leo had said about humility being an open hand. Stefan's willingness to set aside his kickboxing expertise and learn something completely different had made him more capable, not less. Marcus realized he faced the same choice. He could cling to his kung fu identity and tournament victories, treating this as an interesting cultural experience, but nothing that truly challenged his foundation. Or he could genuinely open himself to what the guard had developed over centuries, accepting that his understanding of martial arts was incomplete. They returned to training, and Marcus made a conscious decision. He stopped trying to adapt the guard's techniques to his existing kung fu framework. Instead, he tried to learn them as if he had never trained before, as if his black belt didn't exist. As if the only thing that mattered was understanding what Volker and the other instructors were showing him. It felt vulnerable and uncomfortable, but immediately his learning accelerated. Without his existing techniques interfering, he could see more clearly what the guard system was trying to teach. The final section of the morning covered scenario training. Volker set up situations where guard members had to protect a designated person while others played attackers. The scenarios were chaotic and demanding. Attackers came from multiple directions, used deception, created distractions. The guard members protecting had to maintain awareness of everything while positioning themselves to intercept threats without ever leaving their principle exposed. Marcus watched several scenarios before Volker invited him to participate. They made Marcus the protector, assigned him to stay with Stefan, who played the principal, and sent 3 other guard members to be attackers. The scenario began with everyone standing in a simulated public space. Marcus positioned himself near Stefan, trying to watch all directions simultaneously. The first attacker approached from the front, moving aggressively. Marcus instinctively stepped forward to intercept, using techniques from his competition training. He successfully dealt with that attacker, but in doing so, he had moved away from Stefan. The second attacker immediately closed on the principal from a different angle, while Marcus was still engaged with the first. Volker stopped the scenario and explained Marcus's mistake. His competitor instinct had made him engage the threat aggressively, seeking to neutralize the attacker. But that left Stefan vulnerable. The guard's approach was different. They maintained position, used minimal movement to redirect or stop threats, while never compromising their protective angle. They didn't chase attackers or extend themselves into vulnerable positions. Their entire decision-making process was filtered through the question, does this action keep the principal safe? They ran the scenario again. This time, Marcus forced himself to stay closer to Stefan, to use subtle movements and positioning rather than engaging aggressively. It felt passive and frustrating, like fighting with one hand tied behind his back. But when attackers came, Marcus found that his limited movement options actually simplified his decision-making. He couldn't do anything fancy, so he did only what was necessary. He redirected the first attacker with a simple push while maintaining his position, kept visual contact with the others, adjusted his angle to prevent them from isolating Stefan. The scenario still overwhelmed him eventually, but he had lasted significantly longer. After the third attempt, Marcus began understanding something profound. The guard system wasn't teaching him to fight better. It was teaching him to think differently about what fighting was for. Competition had trained him to see opponents as challenges to overcome, puzzles to solve through superior technique. The guard saw threats as problems to manage with the minimum necessary intervention. It wasn't about winning. It was about ensuring specific outcomes, regardless of what attackers did. The morning session ended at 9 o'clock, 3 hours after it had begun. Marcus was exhausted in ways that went beyond physical fatigue. His mind felt stretched from trying to absorb so much new information while setting aside deeply ingrained habits. Captain Volker gathered everyone for a closing talk. He thanked Marcus for training with them and asked if he planned to return tomorrow. Marcus said yes, without hesitation. Volker nodded and mentioned that the next several days would cover groundwork, weapon defenses, and multiple attacker scenarios. He warned it would be demanding, but said he believed Marcus would learn valuable things if he continued. Approaching the training with the openness he had shown that morning, Marcus spent the rest of that day in his hotel room, alternating between stretching his sore muscles and thinking about everything he had experienced. He had imagined that training with the guard would fill gaps in his martial arts knowledge, would add techniques to his existing repertoire. Instead, it was fundamentally challenging his understanding of what martial arts meant. Competition had given him one lens for viewing combat: controlled environments, matched opponents, defined rules, judges scoring performance. The guard operated through an entirely different lens: protection, uncertainty, immediate life consequences. No one keeping score. Neither lens was wrong. They simply served different purposes. And Marcus realized that his 20 years of training had only explored one of those purposes. He'd become expert in competitive martial arts. It barely scratched the surface of martial arts designed for protection work. Master Lu had tried to point him toward this truth with his comments about understanding rather than defeating. But Marcus hadn't been ready to hear it. He had needed to experience that throat strike from Kristoff, needed to feel his confidence shattered, needed to train alongside people whose skills served purposes beyond winning tournaments. Over the next week, Marcus trained with the guard every morning. Each session revealed new dimensions of their system and new limitations in his understanding. They covered ground fighting that emphasized escaping and standing up, rather than submission grappling. They worked with weapons, showing how to defend against knife attacks that came without warning or telegraphing. They practiced multiple attacker scenarios where survival meant constant movement and awareness, rather than extended engagement with any single opponent. Perhaps most valuable were the conversations that happened during breaks and after training. Guard members shared stories from actual protective operations, situations where their training had been tested against real threats. They talked about the psychological dimension of protection work, maintaining calm readiness for hours or days when nothing happened, while remaining able to respond instantly when something did. They discussed the ethical weight of their role, knowing they might have to harm someone to protect the royal family, but never taking that possibility lightly. Marcus also spent time with Kristoff, the guard member whose throat strike had triggered this entire journey. Over coffee one evening, Kristoff explained his thinking during their exhibition match. He had recognized Marcus's skill immediately and had seen the competitor mindset that Volker later pointed out. Kristoff's near-throat strike hadn't been about showing dominance or humiliating Marcus. It had been a teaching moment, a way to jar Marcus out of his assumptions by showing him something outside his experience. Kristoff apologized if it had seemed harsh, but he believed sometimes people needed shock to see what comfort and success had hidden from them. Marcus assured Kristoff that no apology was necessary. That moment had been exactly what he needed, even though it had been uncomfortable at the time. It had cracked open his certainty and created space for real learning. He asked Kristoff how he maintained the intensity of his training, how he stayed sharp when actual threats were relatively rare. Kristoff explained that every training session was approached with complete seriousness, that they never phoned it in or just went through motions. The respect they had for their role and their mission demanded their best effort always. Complacency would be a betrayal of everyone they existed to protect. By the end of the week, Marcus's body had adapted somewhat to the demanding schedule, though he still finished each session thoroughly exhausted. More significantly, his understanding of martial arts had expanded in ways he was still processing. He could see now how his tournament victories, while real achievements, represented mastery of one specific application rather than mastery of martial arts broadly. He understood that Master Lu's cryptic comments about understanding rather than defeating pointed toward this larger perspective where martial arts served multiple purposes, each requiring different mindsets and approaches. On his final training day, Captain Volker presented Marcus with a small gift, a training manual written in English that outlined the guard's core principles and techniques. It wasn't comprehensive, Volker explained, but it would allow Marcus to continue exploring what he had learned even after returning home. The captain also invited Marcus to return anytime, mentioning that the guard valued ongoing relationships with serious martial artists from other traditions. The exchange of knowledge enriched everyone involved and helped ensure that valuable skills weren't lost over time. Marcus thanked Volker and all the guard members who had trained with him. He acknowledged that he had arrived in Aldermore, thinking he was an expert, believing his black belt and tournament victories meant he had figured out martial arts. They had shown him how much more existed beyond what he had known, and they had done so with patience and respect despite his initial arrogance. That combination of shattering his assumptions while treating him with dignity had made the learning possible. He would carry these lessons home and allow them to reshape his training and teaching. The flight back to San Francisco gave Marcus time to reflect on everything that had changed. He thought about how he would explain this experience to his students at Master Lu's dojo. Simply demonstrating the guard's techniques wouldn't convey the real lessons. The techniques were just expressions of underlying principles about protection, about eliminating unnecessary movement, about maintaining awareness and positioning for outcomes rather than performance. Teaching those principles would require Marcus to first embody them more deeply himself. When he arrived at the dojo the next day, Master Li was waiting with tea prepared. They sat in the small room adjacent to the training floor, and Marcus told his teacher everything. Lu listened with the patient attention of someone who had lived this story himself decades earlier. When Marcus finished, the old master smiled and said he was proud. Not because Marcus had learned specific techniques or gained new capabilities, but because he had learned to question his certainty, to recognize that mastery was not a destination, but a continuous journey of discovery. Master Liu then shared something he had never told Marcus before. In his youth, Liu had been arrogant about his underground tournament victories, believing they proved he had conquered martial arts. Then he met an old security specialist who showed him what real application looked like. That experience had been devastating but transformative. Everything Liu had built since, including this dojo and his teaching approach, flowed from lessons learned in that humbling encounter. He had sent Marcus to Aldermore, hoping his student would have a similar awakening, and he was grateful it had happened while Marcus was still young enough to integrate the lessons fully. Marcus returned to teaching his regular classes, but his approach had changed. He still taught competition techniques and prepared students for tournaments, but he constantly emphasized that these represented one application of martial arts principles, not the totality of the art. He talked about different purposes requiring different mindsets. He encouraged students to remain curious and humble, to recognize that no matter how skilled they became, other perspectives and approaches existed that could teach them new things. 6 months later, Marcus received a letter from Captain Volker. The guard was hosting another exhibition, and they hoped Marcus would return, this time with a clearer understanding of what the event represented. They also mentioned that several guard members had been studying Kung Fu principles, using materials Marcus had shared, finding valuable insights that enriched their own training. The exchange went both ways, Volker wrote. Aldermore's isolation had preserved their system, but also limited it. Connecting with martial artists from other traditions ensured they continued evolving rather than stagnating. Marcus accepted the invitation immediately. This time, he wouldn't arrive as a black belt seeking to prove himself. He would arrive as a perpetual student seeking to learn. That head strike from Kristoff, that moment when his confidence shattered and his assumptions crumbled, had given him something far more valuable than another tournament victory. It had given him humility, the open hand that Master Lu had described, ready to receive what he hadn't known existed. That openness would guide his martial arts journey for the rest of his life, ensuring he never stopped growing, never stopped discovering, never stopped learning from anyone willing to share their knowledge with him.